While the forced labor of Soviet prisoners of war in Nazi German captivity represented an unprecedented crime characterized by genocidal intent, the Soviet Union also created an extensive system for exploiting the labor of prisoners of war. Understanding this system requires careful analysis that neither minimizes the crimes committed nor makes false equivalences between fundamentally different ideological frameworks. The Soviet forced labor system predated World War II, with the Gulag camp network established in the 1920s and expanded dramatically under Stalin in the 1930s. The exploitation of prisoner labor was integral to Soviet economic planning, particularly during the rapid industrialization campaigns. When German and other Axis soldiers were captured during World War II, they were integrated into this existing system of forced labor camps. The numbers involved were substantial. According to Soviet archives, approximately 2.73 million German Wehrmacht personnel were taken prisoner by Soviet forces during the war. However, Western historians' estimates run higher, with some suggesting over 3 million German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. The discrepancies in these figures reflect the chaos of the war's final stages, when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers sought to surrender to Soviet forces, as well as questions about record-keeping and the fate of those who disappeared without being officially registered. Of the German POWs held by the Soviet Union, the mortality rate was significant, but nowhere near the catastrophic levels experienced by Soviet POWs in German hands. Soviet records indicate that 381,067 German Wehrmacht POWs died in NKVD camps, representing a mortality rate of approximately 14%. However, the West German Mash Commission, established to investigate the fate of German POWs, concluded that approximately 1,094,000 died out of 3,060,000 captured, a mortality rate of 35.8%. The truth likely lies between these figures, but even the lower estimate represents hundreds of thousands of deaths. The context: Soviet use of forced labor. To understand the treatment of German POWs, one must first understand the broader Soviet system of forced labor. The Gulag, an acronym for Glavnoy Upravleniy Lagery, or Main Administration of Camps, was a vast network of labor camps that existed throughout the Soviet Union. Between 1929 and 1953, historians estimate that 14 to 18 million people were imprisoned in Gulag labor camps. Additionally, 10 to 11 million people were deported or were already in the penal system. The Gulag camps held a diverse population: political prisoners accused of counter-revolutionary activity, ordinary criminals, kulaks, peasants accused of resisting collectivization, ethnic minorities subjected to mass deportations, and during and after World War II, prisoners of war and civilians from occupied territories. The camps were not uniform in their treatment of prisoners, but in general, conditions were harsh and could be deadly. Workdays in Gulag camps typically lasted 10 to 14 hours. Camps were often marked by unsafe working conditions, insufficient food and clothing, and limited access to medical care. The Soviet Union did not sign the Geneva Conventions, and Soviet authorities felt no obligation to adhere to international standards for the treatment of prisoners. The fundamental philosophy was that prisoners should contribute to the Soviet economy through their labor, regardless of the human cost. Forced labor was instrumental to Soviet industrialization. Prisoners built canals, railways, and roads. They mined coal, gold, and other minerals. They logged timber in the vast forests of Siberia. They constructed dams and hydroelectric stations. Major Soviet infrastructure projects of the 1930s and 1940s were built largely with forced labor. The Moscow-Volga Canal, completed in 1937, was constructed by approximately 200,000 prisoners, thousands of whom died during the project. The integration of POW labor into this existing system was a natural extension of Soviet practice. The decision to use German prisoners as forced laborers was formalized at the highest levels of Allied cooperation. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin demanded 4 million German workers as war reparations. The proposal was refined at the Yalta Conference in January 1945, where British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed to the use of German POW labor. The capture of German prisoners, the final battles. The majority of German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces in the final year of the war, particularly during the Great Soviet Offensives of 1944 to 1945. As the Red Army advanced westward, destroying German army groups and encircling entire armies, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 to 1943 had resulted in the capture of approximately 91,000 German soldiers, of whom only about 6,000 would survive to return to Germany. But this was only a prelude to the massive captures that would occur in the war's final year. The destruction of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 resulted in the capture of tens of thousands of German soldiers. The encirclement of German forces in Courland, East Prussia, and Silesia produced hundreds of thousands more prisoners. The final Battle of Berlin and the subsequent German surrender in May 1945 brought the largest wave of captures, with approximately 2 million German soldiers ending up in Soviet hands in the war's final weeks. The circumstances of capture varied widely. Some German soldiers fought to the last bullet before surrendering. Others laid down their arms willingly, exhausted by years of war and relieved that their ordeal was ending. Many German units sought desperately to surrender to American or British forces rather than to the Soviets. Having heard accounts of brutal treatment and fearing retribution for German atrocities in the Soviet Union, the U.S. and Britain generally accepted these surrenders. But under agreements with the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were subsequently transferred to Soviet custody. The initial treatment of captured German soldiers by Soviet forces was often harsh and sometimes brutal. Soviet soldiers had witnessed the devastation of their homeland, had lost family members and comrades, and many sought revenge against the invaders. Beatings, summary executions, and robbery of prisoners occurred, although the extent varied depending on the individual Soviet units involved and the circumstances of capture. The long marches from the front to transit camps claimed many lives. German soldiers, often already weakened by combat, insufficient rations, and the hardships of retreat, were force-marched hundreds of miles to collection points. Those who could not keep pace were left behind or shot. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was particularly harsh, and thousands of prisoners died of exposure during these marches. Organization of the POW camp system. Once captured, German soldiers entered a network of prisoner-of-war camps administered by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police organization. The system was designated UPV, Upravlenie, Podelam Voyenoplenik I Internirovanik, separate from but parallel to the Gulag system. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union operated hundreds of POW camps across its territory, from the western borderlands to the remote reaches of Siberia and Central Asia. The camps varied considerably in size, conditions, and purpose. Large central camps served as collection and distribution points, while smaller work camps housed prisoners at construction sites, mines, and industrial facilities. The geographic distribution was determined by economic needs. Prisoners were sent to regions where labor shortages were most acute and where major reconstruction or development projects were underway. Upon arrival at a camp, prisoners underwent registration, a process that was often chaotic and incomplete in the war years. Prisoners were assigned numbers, had their personal property confiscated, and were sorted based on health, skills, and perceived political reliability. Officers were generally separated from enlisted men. Those with technical skills, engineers, electricians, doctors, might receive preferential treatment based on their utility. Medical screening at the camps was cursory at best. Many prisoners arrived suffering from wounds, frostbite, disease, and severe malnutrition. The camp medical facilities were overwhelmed and under-resourced. Typhus, dysentery, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through the crowded camps. In the immediate post-war period, mortality rates in some camps reached alarming levels, particularly in the winter of 1945 to 1946. Housing conditions in the camps were generally poor. Prisoners slept in crowded wooden barracks, often on wooden bunks with minimal bedding. Heating was inadequate for the harsh Soviet winters. Sanitation facilities were primitive, contributing to the spread of disease. Camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, though the remote location of many camps in Siberia and Central Asia made escape attempts nearly futile. Food rations in Soviet POW camps were insufficient but varied depending on work performance, camp conditions, and the overall state of Soviet food supplies. The Soviet Union itself had suffered tremendous damage during the war, with agricultural regions devastated and food production severely disrupted. The population at large faced food shortages and rationing. Under these circumstances, POWs were low priority for food distribution. The basic ration consisted of bread, usually 400 to 700 grams per day, depending on work assignment, supplemented with soup or porridge made from grains, occasional small amounts of vegetables, and rarely fish or meat. This provided perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day, insufficient for men performing heavy labor. Prisoners who met or exceeded work quotas received larger rations. Those who failed to meet quotas had rations reduced, creating a vicious cycle where weakened prisoners received less food and became weaker still. The work, rebuilding a devastated nation. The forced labor of German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union served multiple purposes. Most fundamentally, it was viewed as restitution for the enormous damage inflicted on the Soviet Union by the German invasion. The war had killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, destroyed thousands of cities and villages, and devastated Soviet industry and agriculture. In the Soviet view, German prisoners should contribute to repairing this damage. Soviet authorities calculated that between 1943 and 1950, German POWs performed approximately 1.1 billion person-days of labor, valued at roughly 50 billion rubles. This labor was critical to Soviet post-war reconstruction. The scale and scope of the work performed by German prisoners was enormous, spanning virtually every sector of the Soviet economy. In construction, German POWs rebuilt destroyed cities and towns across the Western Soviet Union. They constructed apartment buildings, factories, schools, and hospitals. In Moscow, prisoners worked on the construction of the Moscow State University main building, one of the famous Seven Sisters skyscrapers built in Stalinist architectural style. In Stalingrad, now Volgograd, where the city had been almost entirely destroyed during the battle, German prisoners participated in clearing rubble and constructing new buildings. Railway construction and repair consumed enormous amounts of POW labor. The Soviet railway network had been severely damaged during the war, with thousands of miles of track destroyed, bridges blown up, and stations demolished. German prisoners laid new railway lines, rebuilt bridges, repaired locomotives and rolling stock, and constructed railway stations. This work was essential for restoring the Soviet transportation network and supporting economic recovery. Mining represented one of the most dangerous and demanding assignments for German POWs. Prisoners worked in coal mines in the Donbass region, uranium mines in Central Asia, and various other mineral extraction operations. Mining work was physically exhausting, performed in dangerous conditions with minimal safety equipment. Accidents were common, and many prisoners died in mine collapses or from mining-related diseases like silicosis. In the forestry sector, German prisoners worked in the vast timber camps of Siberia and the Russian north. Logging was brutal work, particularly in winter when temperatures could plunge to 40 degrees below zero. Prisoners felled trees with handsaws and axes, transported logs to rivers for floating to sawmills, and worked in sawmills processing timber. The combination of extreme cold, heavy labor, and inadequate clothing and food made forestry camps particularly deadly. Agricultural work was relatively common, especially in the immediate post-war years when Soviet agriculture struggled to recover from wartime disruption. German prisoners worked on collective farms, planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, and performing general farm labor. While less dangerous than mining or logging, agricultural work still involved long hours of physical labor, often with insufficient food and poor living conditions. Industrial facilities employed significant numbers of German POWs. Prisoners worked in factories producing machinery, chemicals, textiles, and consumer goods. Those with technical skills might work in their specialties. German engineers and technicians contributed to Soviet industrial development, sometimes working on advanced projects. A small number of German scientists and specialists were retained for years after other prisoners had been released, working on Soviet military and technological programs. Dam and hydroelectric station construction utilized POW labor extensively. These massive projects required enormous amounts of manual labor for excavation, concrete work, and construction. German prisoners worked on several major hydroelectric projects in the Soviet Union during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Conditions and treatment. A mixed picture. The treatment of German prisoners in Soviet camps varied considerably depending on time, place, and circumstances. Unlike the Nazi treatment of Soviet POWs, which was characterized by systematic abuse rooted in racial ideology, Soviet treatment of German prisoners was more pragmatic, though often harsh. The worst period for German POWs was the immediate post-war years, particularly 1945 to 1947. During this time, mortality rates were highest, reaching levels comparable to those of Soviet citizens in the devastated regions. The combination of war damage, food shortages affecting the entire Soviet population, overwhelmed camp systems, and the physical condition of prisoners created a deadly situation. Many prisoners arrived at camps already weakened by combat, wounds, and the hardships of capture and transport. Without adequate medical care and nutrition, they succumbed to disease and exhaustion. However, as the Soviet Union's economic situation stabilized and camp systems became more organized, conditions generally improved. By 1948 to 1949, mortality rates had declined significantly. The Soviet authorities recognized that dead prisoners provided no labor, and economic pragmatism dictated keeping prisoners alive and reasonably healthy to maximize their work output. Treatment by guards and camp administrators varied widely. Some guards were brutal, beating prisoners, withholding food, and imposing harsh punishments for minor infractions. Other guards were relatively humane, recognizing the prisoners as human beings caught in the aftermath of a terrible war. Similarly, some camp administrators ran their facilities with unnecessary cruelty, while others worked to improve conditions within the constraints of the system. German prisoners sometimes formed their own internal social structures and support networks within camps. Officers and NCOs often maintained military discipline among prisoners, which could provide structure and mutual support, but could also create tensions. Prisoners with particular skills, or those who learned Russian, might secure better work assignments or positions of relative privilege within the camp hierarchy. Medical care in the camps improved over time, but remained inadequate by Western standards. Camp hospitals were chronically short of medicines, equipment, and qualified staff. German military doctors captured along with combat troops sometimes provided medical care to their fellow prisoners, working with minimal resources. Serious illnesses or injuries often resulted in death simply because proper treatment was unavailable. Special categories and war crimes trials. Not all German prisoners in Soviet custody were treated equally. Soviet authorities identified several special categories of prisoners who received different treatment, usually worse than the general POW population. SS members, Gestapo officers, and others identified as having committed war crimes were separated from regular Wehrmacht prisoners. These individuals faced investigation, trial, and in many cases, execution or long prison sentences. The Soviet Union conducted numerous war crimes trials of German personnel accused of atrocities against Soviet civilians and POWs. Some of these trials were legitimate attempts to achieve justice for genuine war crimes. Others were show trials designed for propaganda purposes. Several thousand German prisoners were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 25 years in forced labor camps. These convicted POWs, or Kriegsverurteilt, remained in prison long after other prisoners had been released. They were not repatriated until 1955 to 1956, following the intervention of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer with Soviet leadership. High-ranking German officers received special treatment, sometimes better and sometimes worse than ordinary prisoners. Some were held in special camps where conditions were relatively comfortable, as Soviet authorities hoped to extract military information or gain propaganda value from their cooperation. Others were interrogated harshly or held in isolation. A small group of German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists were retained for much longer than ordinary prisoners. These individuals, including specialists in rocketry, aviation, chemistry, and other advanced fields, worked on Soviet military and industrial programs. For example, Helmut Grautrup, a German rocket scientist, worked on Soviet ballistic missile development. Manfred von Ardenne, a physicist, contributed to the Soviet atomic bomb project and was later awarded a Stalin Prize. These specialists were not mistreated in the same way as ordinary POWs, but were essentially compelled to work for the Soviet Union for years after the war ended. Release and repatriation. The release of German prisoners from Soviet captivity occurred in stages over more than a decade. The process was influenced by political considerations, Soviet economic needs, and international pressures. A large number of German POWs were released relatively quickly. By the end of 1946, the Soviet Union held fewer POWs than the United Kingdom and France combined. Many sick and disabled prisoners were repatriated in the immediate post-war period, as they could perform little useful labor. Additionally, Austrian prisoners were released at a faster rate than Germans, partly due to political considerations regarding Austria's status as a separate nation. The creation of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in October 1949 led to an acceleration of releases. The Soviet Union sought to establish good relations with a new communist German state, and the repatriation of POWs was part of this effort. By the end of 1949, all but approximately 85,000 prisoners had been released. However, those 85,000 prisoners, mostly individuals convicted of war crimes or awaiting trial, remained in Soviet custody for years. Their fate became a major issue in West Germany, where families campaigned for their release and the government made repatriation a foreign policy priority. The prisoners themselves lived in a state of limbo, uncertain when or if they would ever be released. The breakthrough came in 1955 when West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow to negotiate the establishment of diplomatic relations between West Germany and the Soviet Union. As part of these negotiations, the Soviets agreed to release the remaining prisoners. In 1955 and 1956, the last German POWs returned home, more than a decade after the war had ended. The returning prisoners faced numerous challenges. Many had been gone for 10 to 15 years. Their families had often given them up for dead and moved on with their lives. Germany itself had been transformed, divided into East and West. Prisoners had to readjust to civilian life, find employment, and come to terms with their experiences. Some never fully recovered from the trauma of years in captivity. Civilian deportations, a related tragedy. Beyond military prisoners of war, the Soviet Union also deported hundreds of thousands of ethnic German civilians from Eastern Europe for forced labor. This deportation program began as early as December 1944 and continued into 1945 as Soviet forces advanced through territories with significant ethnic German populations. In Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, ethnic Germans were rounded up and transported to the Soviet Union. The criteria for deportation varied, but generally included ethnic Germans aged 18 to 40 who were deemed fit for work. Entire communities were sometimes affected, with young men and women separated from their families and shipped eastward. The numbers involved were substantial. From Yugoslavia alone, between 27,000 and 30,000 ethnic Germans were sent to the Soviet Union after Christmas 1944. From Romania, tens of thousands more were deported. In total, historians estimate that several 100,000 German civilians were taken to the Soviet Union for forced labor. These civilian deportees faced conditions similar to or worse than military POWs. They had committed no crime and had held no military position. Their only offense was their ethnicity. Many were women who faced particular hardships, including sexual violence. The mortality rate among civilian deportees was high, with some estimates suggesting that 15 to 20% died during their time in Soviet captivity. One case documented in the German Red Cross records illustrates the human tragedy. Pauline Gullner, born in 1926 in Transylvania, was arrested on January 15, 1945, and sent to forced labor in coal mines in Ukraine. She died there on February 26, 1949, at the age of 23. Her story represents one of hundreds of thousands of similar tragedies. Comparative analysis: German versus Soviet experiences. Comparing the experiences of Soviet POWs in German captivity with German POWs in Soviet captivity reveals both similarities and crucial differences. Both groups faced forced labor, inadequate food, harsh living conditions, and high mortality rates. Both groups were exploited for economic gain by the capturing power. Both groups included men who suffered terribly through no fault of their own beyond having served their countries in wartime. However, the scale, intent, and implementation of the two systems differed fundamentally. The Nazi treatment of Soviet POWs was characterized by an explicit genocidal intent rooted in racial ideology. German military and civilian authorities deliberately allowed and caused millions of deaths through starvation, exposure, and murder. The mortality rate of approximately 58% among Soviet POWs reflected a conscious policy of annihilation. The Soviet treatment of German POWs, while harsh and sometimes brutal, was not driven by the same eliminationist ideology. The Soviets sought to exploit POW labor for economic reconstruction, not to exterminate German prisoners as a matter of policy. The mortality rate, while significant at 14 to 36%, depending on sources, was lower than the Soviet rate, and most deaths occurred in the chaotic conditions of the war's end and immediate aftermath, rather than as a result of deliberate extermination. The treatment of POWs by Western allies provides another point of comparison. British and American forces also held millions of German prisoners, and while conditions varied, the overall mortality rate was much lower, around 1%. German prisoners in Western captivity were generally treated in accordance with Geneva Convention provisions. They performed labor, but under better conditions than those in Soviet captivity. Most were released by 1948 to 1949. The broader context also matters. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses during the German invasion. 27 million dead, thousands of cities and villages destroyed, and enormous economic damage. The desire for retribution and the desperate need for labor to rebuild occurred in this context of national trauma. Germany's crimes in the Soviet Union, including not just the treatment of POWs, but also the murder of millions of civilians, created an environment in which harsh treatment of German prisoners seemed justified to many Soviets. The role of Western allies. The Western allies played a complex role in the fate of German POWs. Under agreements reached at Yalta and other conferences, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had surrendered to American and British forces were subsequently transferred to Soviet custody. This was particularly controversial in cases where German units had specifically sought to surrender to Western forces to avoid Soviet captivity. The transfers began in May 1945 and continued through the summer. Exact numbers are disputed, but historians estimate that several 100,000 German prisoners were handed over. The New York Times reported at the time that thousands were being transferred from Western POW camps to Soviet authorities. Some historians have characterized this as a gesture of friendship toward the Soviet Union. Others have called it a betrayal of prisoners who had sought Western protection. The Western Allies also used German POW labor, though under different conditions than in the Soviet Union. In France, approximately 740,000 German prisoners performed forced labor, some of them in highly dangerous mine-clearing operations. By September 1945, French authorities estimated that 2,000 German prisoners per month were being killed or maimed in accidents during mine-clearing work. In Britain, German prisoners worked primarily in agriculture. In 1946, a fifth of all agricultural work in the UK was performed by German prisoners. By 1947, this had increased to 25% of the agricultural workforce. A public debate emerged in Britain about the ethics and legality of retaining German prisoners for labor, but economic arguments prevailed, and many prisoners remained until 1948. The United States held tens of thousands of German prisoners on American soil, where they worked on farms, in mills, and in canneries. They were paid nominal wages, 80 cents per day, compared to the $2.82 per day earned by American farm laborers in 1946. Most German POWs in American custody were released by the end of 1948. Long-term consequences and historical memory. The forced labor of prisoners of war during and after World War II had profound long-term consequences for individuals, nations, and international law. For individual prisoners who survived, the experience left deep psychological and physical scars. Many struggled with trauma, health problems resulting from malnutrition and harsh conditions, and difficulties readjusting to civilian life. For Germany, the fate of POWs in Soviet custody remained a sensitive political issue for decades. The West German government made the return of prisoners a priority, and their eventual release in 1955 to 1956 was celebrated as a national achievement. However, the integration of returnees into post-war German society was not always smooth. Some felt forgotten or abandoned. Others faced suspicion or hostility. For the Soviet Union, the use of German POW labor was seen as justified retribution for German crimes and as a contribution to Reconstruction. Soviet propaganda emphasized the crimes committed by Germany and portrayed the use of POW labor as moderate and humane compared to what might have been justified. The experiences of Soviet POWs in German captivity received less attention initially, as returning Soviet prisoners were often viewed with suspicion and faced discrimination. The treatment of POWs by all sides contributed to the development of international humanitarian law after the war. The Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war was revised and strengthened in 1949, partly in response to the abuses of World War II. However, implementation and enforcement remained problematic, as subsequent conflicts demonstrated. The question of justice and compensation. The issue of compensation for forced labors took decades to address. German companies that had used forced labor during the war, including major corporations like Volkswagen, Siemens, Krupp, and others, initially resisted compensation claims. Some denied knowledge of conditions or argued that they had paid the SS for the labor and therefore had fulfilled their obligations. Between the 1950s and 1960s, some limited compensation was provided through settlements with Western German firms, facilitated by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany. However, most former forced laborers from Eastern Europe received nothing, as West Germany refused to make payments to countries in the Eastern Bloc, and the German Democratic Republic rejected paying compensation on principle. It was not until the 1990s, when Jewish victim organizations initiated class action lawsuits against German companies in the United States, that significant movement occurred. Facing legal and public relations pressure, the German government and major corporations established a compensation fund. In 2000, the foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future was created with 10 billion German marks, about 5 billion euros, to compensate forced laborers. However, this compensation came too late for most victims. By 2000, the majority of World War II forced laborers had died. Only about 1.7 million former forced laborers received payments, typically ranging from a few hundred to a few $1,000s. Recipients were required to sign waivers giving up rights to further legal action. Given the years of suffering and the profits earned through their exploitation, these payments represented a tiny fraction of what might have been considered just compensation. Western forced labor, France, Britain, and others. While the Soviet use of German POW labor was the largest and longest-lasting program, other Allied nations also used German prisoners for forced labor after the war. These programs, while smaller in scale and shorter in duration, raised similar ethical questions about the treatment of prisoners of war. France employed approximately 740,000 German prisoners in forced labor programs. Many of these prisoners came from the Rheinweisenlager camps operated by the Americans, where conditions had been poor. Upon arrival in France, prisoners were already weakened, with some weighing barely 50 kilograms, 110 pounds. The prisoners worked in reconstruction, agriculture, and notably in mine-clearing operations. Mine clearing was particularly dangerous and controversial. France had been heavily mined during the war, and German prisoners were forced to clear these mines, often with minimal training or equipment. German protests that forcing POWs to clear mines violated Article 32 of the Geneva Conventions were rejected on the grounds that the Germans had surrendered unconditionally and therefore lost their protections as POWs. The casualty rates were horrific. By September 1945, an estimated 2,000 German prisoners per month were being killed or maimed in accidents. In Norway, German prisoners were used to clear the extensive minefields left along the coast. Records from August 1945 show that 275 German soldiers had been killed clearing mines, with 392 severely wounded and 167 lightly wounded. The 2015 Danish film Land of Mine dramatized similar operations in Denmark. where over 2,000 German prisoners cleared more than 1.3 million landmines from Danish beaches and fields between May and September 1945, with 149 losing their lives. Britain's use of German POW labor focused primarily on agriculture. In 1946, German prisoners performed 1/5 of all agricultural work in Britain. By 1947, this had increased to 1/4. The British government faced public criticism for using German prisoners years after the war had ended, with debates in Parliament and protests in the media. However, economic arguments prevailed, with the Ministry of Agriculture arguing that releasing German workers would harm British agricultural production. The United States used German prisoners on American soil for agricultural and industrial work. Tens of thousands of Axis prisoners worked in American farms, mills, and canneries, receiving nominal pay. The conditions in American POW camps were generally good by wartime standards, with adequate food, housing, and medical care. Most prisoners were released by 1948, though some were transferred to European countries for continued labor. The broader legacy: forced labor and total war. The massive use of forced labor during World War II represented a disturbing feature of total war. All major belligerents, Germany, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, used coerced labor to varying extents. The scale ranged from Nazi Germany's 20 million forced laborers to smaller programs in other countries. But the principle was similar. Prisoners, occupied populations, and conquered peoples could be compelled to work for the war effort or post-war reconstruction. This widespread use of forced labor challenged traditional distinctions between military and civilian, between combatants and non-combatants, between acceptable wartime measures and war crimes. It demonstrated how modern industrial warfare, with its enormous demands for labor and production, created pressures that pushed nations toward increasingly exploitative practices. The Nazi program was unique in its combination of scale, brutality, and genocidal intent. No other nation implemented forced labor with the explicit goal of working entire categories of people to death. However, the widespread use of forced labor by multiple nations suggests that the practice was not simply an aberration, but rather a feature of total war in the industrial age. Conclusion: remembering and learning. The forced labor of prisoners of war during World War II resulted in the deaths of millions and the suffering of many millions more. Soviet prisoners in German hands experienced catastrophic mortality rates due to deliberate Nazi policies of starvation and annihilation. German prisoners in Soviet hands faced harsh conditions and significant mortality, though not approaching the scale of Nazi crimes. Prisoners of all nationalities used by various powers faced exploitation, danger, and hardship. These histories matter for several reasons. First, they represent an enormous human tragedy that deserves to be remembered. Each of the millions who suffered and died was an individual human being with a life, a family, hopes, and dreams. Their experiences should not be forgotten or minimized. Second, these histories reveal important truths about war, ideology, and human behavior. They show how ideologies of racial superiority can lead to genocidal policies. They demonstrate how economic pressures can push nations toward exploitative practices. They illustrate the vulnerability of prisoners and the importance of international humanitarian law. Third, understanding these histories helps prevent similar tragedies in the future. The strengthened Geneva Conventions adopted after World War II directly responded to the abuses documented during the war. Continued vigilance is necessary to ensure that prisoners in contemporary conflicts receive humane treatment. Fourth, these histories raise ongoing questions about justice, compensation, and reconciliation. The inadequate compensation provided to forced laborers, The long delays in acknowledging suffering and the difficulties in holding institutions accountable all offer lessons for addressing contemporary human rights abuses. The story of forced labor during World War II is complex, involving multiple nations, millions of individuals, and competing narratives. It cannot be reduced to simple moral lessons or equivalences. Nazi Germany's treatment of Soviet POWs represented a unique crime, characterized by genocidal intent and catastrophic results. The Soviet Union's treatment of German POWs, while harsh and resulting in significant mortality, was different in intent and implementation. The Western Allies' use of German labor, though controversial, was more limited and less deadly. Yet all these programs shared fundamental features: the coercion of prisoners, the exploitation of their labor, insufficient food and shelter, dangerous working conditions, and inadequate medical care. All resulted in unnecessary deaths and suffering. All raise questions about the treatment of prisoners in wartime and the obligations of capturing powers. As we move further from World War II, with fewer survivors remaining to testify to their experiences, the importance of historical research and documentation increases. The opening of archives in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe has enabled more complete understanding of these events. Continued research is necessary to document individual experiences, understand the full scope of forced labor programs, and ensure that this history is not forgotten. The forced labor of prisoners of war during World War II stands as a warning about the capacity for cruelty that exists in human societies, particularly during wartime and under ideological systems that dehumanize others. It also testifies to the resilience of the human spirit, as millions of prisoners endured years of hardship and somehow found the strength to survive. Their experiences deserve to be remembered, studied, and used to build a more humane world.